The Killing Shadow. In the 19th century, the city of Boston was shaken by a series of violent crimes that had the population on edge. Local police were baffled by the lack of leads and the apparent lack of motives for the killers. But there was one man who wasn't about to stand idly by as terror gripped the city streets. Auguste Dupin, a private detective of French origin who had built a great reputation in his home country and who was now willing to put his experience to the service of justice in Boston. Dupin, in fact, had been hired to solve one of the most terrible cases that had occurred in the city, the murder of a lady from high society, Mrs. St. Clair, a lady who had inspired a secret love poem by the philosopher William James. To my dearest Mrs. St. Clair, in your presence, my heart takes flight, and my soul feels a pure delight. For you are a vision of grace and beauty, and your aura radiates pure purity. The winds of change may blow us apart, but they will never dim the flame in my heart. For your memory is etched in my mind, and in my heart you will always find. I dream of you day and night, of your smile so warm and bright, and I long to hold you in my arms, to protect you from any harms. You are the star that lights my way, and the sunshine that brightens my day. Without you, my life would be incomplete, for in you I have found my heart's beat. My dear Mrs. St. Clair, hear my plea, and know that my love will always be a flame that burns eternally. For you, my sweetest destiny. Detective Auguste Dupin had been working on the case of the murdered lady for weeks. He had questioned many suspects, but Lucas, the victim's gardener, had always seemed particularly disturbing. Lucas had been seen near the crime scene at the time of the murder. Dupin looked at Lucas, his piercing eyes conveying an air of authority. Mr. Lucas, I am here to investigate the murder of Mrs. St. Clair. Your name has come up in connection with the crime, and I would like to ask you a few questions. Lucas shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting around the room. I don't know what you're talking about. I had nothing to do with that woman's death, he protested. Dupin leaned forward, his voice low and steady. You were seen entering her house on the night of the murder. Your alibi is weak at best. Care to explain? Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes avoiding Dupin's gaze. I was there, yes, but only to deliver a package. I didn't stay long, and I certainly didn't kill anyone. Dupin raised an eyebrow. And what was in this package, Mr. Lucas? Lucas hesitated, but then relented. It was a letter. Mrs. St. Clair had asked me to deliver it to her husband, who was out of town. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Dupin sat back, considering Lucas's story. And where were you after you left Mrs. St. Clair's house? Lucas looked uncomfortable. I went home, sir. I swear it. Dupin studied Lucas for a moment longer, then stood up. Thank you for your time, Mr. Lucas. I may have further questions for you later. As Lucas watched Dupin leave the room, he knew that his weak alibi would not be enough to convince the detective of his innocence. He could feel his shadowy alter ego, the one who had driven him to commit the murder, closing in on him. 2. Dupin had been following Lucas for several days, trying to find any evidence that could connect him to the murder. Something Lucas had told police during one of the interrogations puzzled him. Lucas had mentioned that his shadow was constantly berating him, telling him that he had to do something about it. A policeman recalled that Lucas seemed disturbed by this shadow, as if he were in conflict with himself. He decided that he needed to investigate further and began looking for information on Lucas's shadow. He went to the Boston Police main station, where he met Captain Brando. Lucas is the culprit, exclaimed Brando as he drank a dip of coffee from a The Simpson mug. The fellow had quite an imagination, and let us know all about your case. Dupin received what was supposed to be Mrs. St. Clair's letter to her husband. The Murderous Shadow. A Delirium Tremens Story. By Lucas Lovelace. Once upon a time, there was a butcher named Lucas, who had committed numerous heinous crimes in his town. Despite the efforts of the local police, they were never able to find enough evidence to convict him. Lucas, however, was not blameless. Often, at night, his shadow scolded him for his actions. Shrieks were heard as Lucas's shadow moved independently of him, accusing him and pointing at him with long, dark fingers. Lucas knew he couldn't escape his shadow, and he soon became obsessed with getting rid of it. He started lighting fires in his house and other places, trying to burn his shadow along with everything else. But each time he lit a fire, the shadow only seemed to grow darker and more menacing. Lucas decided then to study black magic, trying to perform a ritual to rid himself of his shadow. But the evil spirits were contrary to Lucas' designs, and the shadow took on a life of its own. It turned into an evil being that incited Lucas not to impede, but to commit murder. "What do you think of that bunch of lies?" interrupted Captain Brando. Dupin was horrified. Contrary to most policemen, he took seriously such lies, for they contained a terrifying truth. Lucas had not acted alone in the murder of the high society lady. He had been influenced by his own shadow. He went on reading. After a huge fire that destroyed a large part of the town, Lucas was found in the center of the fire. He was standing, arms outstretched, and his shadow stretched out behind him, larger and darker than ever. But as the flames consumed it, the shadow began to fade. When the firefighters were finally able to get into the burning house, they found only a charred body and a weak, shivering shadow on the wall. Since then, the townspeople have told the story of Lucas and his shadow suppressing him until he was consumed by fire. Many say they can still see his shadow wandering the walls and trees, looking for his next victim. "We can only accuse him of madness," concluded Brandon, keeping the letter in one of his desk drawers. Dupin did not give up. He dedicated himself to following Lucas closely, observing him from a neighboring house. He studied the design plans of Lucas' house, and on Walpurgis night, taking advantage of the tumult created by children and young adults dressed as vampires and universal monsters, Dupin was able to trespass into Lucas' house. He advanced through a corridor and entered into a small bathroom. He opened a fuse box, unplugged several wires, and uncovered a crack on the wall. He approached his eye and saw Lucas sat alone in his dark and musty room, surrounded by strange symbols and candles. Based on the debris scattered over the floor, several candlesticks, and a volume entitled Umbra Alchimiae, Dupin gathered that Lucas had just finished a ritual he believed would banish his shadow forever. But as he sat there, Dupin noticed the flickering light of the candles casting a distorted image of Lucas' shadow on the wall. Lucas sighed in frustration. Suddenly, the shadow began to move and took on a life of its own. Lucas gasped in shock as it detached from the wall and took on a human form. "What do you want from me?" Lucas asked, fear trembling in his voice. "I am your shadow," the shadow replied. "I am a part of you that you cannot simply banish with magic. You cannot escape me. I don't want you here." Lucas shouted. "But I am here," the shadow said calmly. "I am the manifestation of all that you have repressed, your darkest desires and fears. You cannot simply ignore me." Lucas stood up, his eyes wide with anger. "I will find a way to get rid of you," he said. "You will not control me anymore." "But I am not here to control you," the shadow said. "I am here to guide you. Embrace me, and together we can become something greater." Lucas hesitated for a moment, then sat back down. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You have been denying yourself your true desires, your true power," the shadow said. "But with me by your side, we can unleash your full potential." Lucas looked at his shadow, then closed his eyes in deep thought. Dupin trembled. Could it be true? Could he really find power by embracing his darkest desires? The entity constantly harassing and reprimanding Lucas for his actions was actually Lucas' own shadow. The shadow looked straight at Dupin then. He felt caught in flagrant and ran away like a thief. He had found an explanation for Lucas's behavior, but he had also witnessed something supernatural and terrifying. How could he explain what he had seen? At home, Dupin reread some passages from his psychology books and abducted that Lucas had lost his sanity and that his shadow was actually his conscience, haunting and tormenting him relentlessly. On the 1st of November, Dupin stood up, took a bath, had a light breakfast and dressed himself up to go to Boston Police Main Station. But before Dupin could bring Lucas to justice, the gardener's house caught fire. When the firefighters arrived, at about 11 a.m., they found only the ashes of the man who had once been Lucas.